The barrel of a gun has its own kind of gravity. When aimed at your chest, it becomes the center of your universe, compressing time, narrowing vision, silencing everything but the thundering of your own heartbeat. For some, it brings fear. For others, clarity. At Arlington National Cemetery, beneath a sky-threatening rain that never falls, a decorated general stands motionless before a weapon that should never have been drawn. No flinch, no plea, just unwavering eyes meeting hatred with dignity. They say courage isn't the absence of fear, but what you do in its presence. They say honor isn't born from medals, but from the moments you refuse to back down when someone points a gun at your chest. This is not a story about death, though death brought us here. It's about the weapons we don't see, the ones that kill careers, bury truth in silence, those who dare to speak. It's about systems designed to absorb pressure without changing, and the unbending few who stand tall when standing becomes dangerous. Some battles are fought with bullets, others with truth. The most important ones are fought with both. The barrel of the gun seemed impossibly large from 6 feet away. Lieutenant General Olivia Washington did not blink. She did not flinch. The weight of her dress uniform, adorned with the Purple Heart and other commendations earned over 3 decades of service, felt suddenly imperceptible against the gravity of the moment. Around her, Arlington National Cemetery had fallen silent, hundreds of mourners, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The gun didn't waver in Sullivan's hand. His knuckles whitened against the black metal index finger, tense against the trigger. His eyes, cold, unblinking, filled with something far beyond hatred locked with Olivia's. For 3 heartbeats, the world ceased to exist beyond this singular connection, a black female general and a white former military candidate linked by the invisible thread of a weapon between them. Time slowed. The gentle May breeze carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and ceremonial roses ceased. The soft rustling of dress uniforms stilled. Even the distant call of birds fell away into nothingness. From 10 feet away, 8-year-old Jamal Collins watched his small hand clutching his mother's fingers. His child's mind couldn't comprehend the politics or the hatred, but he understood the visual language of power perfectly. A tall woman in uniform standing straight, refusing to cower before a threat. "Why is that man afraid of her?" "Mama!" he whispered, his voice carrying in the terrible silence. The question hung in the air, unanswered. 12 hours earlier, the pre-dawn air bit at Olivia's face as she unlocked her office door at the Pentagon. The hallway stood empty at 4:38 a.m., but Olivia had long ago made peace with solitude. She preferred the building this way, before the day's politics and posturing began, when she could hear her own thoughts echo against the walls. Her office bore the Spartan efficiency of someone who understood that permanence was an illusion. 3 decades in uniform had taught her that attachment to place was a luxury afforded to civilians. The only personal item on display was a small silver-framed photograph of her unit from 15 years ago, 8 faces smiling beneath the Afghan sun arms, draped over shoulders immortalized in a moment of camaraderie that felt like another lifetime. Olivia's fingers traced the glass covering Sergeant Marcus Collins' face. His smile had always been the brightest even then, genuine, unmarred by cynicism. He'd been the unit's heart, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who carried extra water for others without being asked, who wrote letters home for those who couldn't find the right words. "I told you not to be a hero," she whispered to the photograph, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. She moved to the steel cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a key she kept separate from the others. Inside, a simple wooden box bore no markings except a small engraving. Sergeant Marcus Collins, USMC, 1990-2024. She lifted it gently, feeling the weight of ashes that once constituted a man who had saved her life twice, once in combat and once in the crushing aftermath of their return. Olivia placed the box carefully in her leather briefcase. Today she would fulfill her promise to bring him home one last time. As she closed the cabinet, her phone vibrated with a text message. Security arrangements confirmed for 1,400 hours. Lieutenant Sullivan assigned as ceremony security lead. Olivia frowned. She didn't recognize the name Sullivan, but something in her gut, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours, tightened uncomfortably. She made a mental note to run a background check before the ceremony. The soft ping of the elevator arriving broke her concentration. At this hour, the sound was unusual enough to make her pause. Voices drifted down the hallway, hushed, urgent. And her needs to be contained. The Collins situation could become problematic. General Washington is handling the funeral arrangements personally. It's a non-issue. Nothing involving her is ever a non-issue. Her very existence is political. Olivia recognized Colonel Monroe's voice immediately, the smooth, practiced tone of a man who'd built his career navigating the Pentagon's political labyrinth. The other voice belonged to someone higher in the chain, though she couldn't place it immediately. She stepped back into her office, leaving the door open just enough to listen. Washington needs to understand her place, the unknown voice continued. She's been given unprecedented latitude because of her background. The optics work in our favor, but her influence needs boundaries. Sir, with respect, she's one of our most decorated officers. Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Medals don't make policy, Colonel. Remember that. The voices faded as they turned the corner. Olivia closed her door silently, her mind already calculating the implications. The Collins situation could only refer to Marcus's death and the circumstances surrounding it. Circumstances that the official report had sanitized into meaninglessness. She retrieved her laptop and initiated a search for Lieutenant Sullivan. The results loaded slowly as if the system itself were reluctant to reveal its secrets. Lieutenant James Sullivan. Age 32. Failed psychological evaluation for Special Forces 3 years prior. Note reinstatement approved by Colonel Monroe, despite documented concerns regarding authority issues and racial bias indicators. Assigned to ceremonial detail 6 months ago. Attached was a personnel photo of a man with close-cropped blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and a jawline so tight it seemed to be holding back something volatile. His expression was neutral, professional, but his eyes held the flat, assessing gaze of someone cataloging weaknesses. Olivia closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The morning light had begun to filter through her window, casting long shadows across the office floor. In those shadows, she could almost see the outlines of a chess game, taking shape, pieces being positioned hours before the ceremony. Marcus had warned her in their last conversation 3 weeks before his accident. "The system isn't broken, Liv," he'd said, his voice low over the secure line. "It's functioning exactly as designed. That's what makes it so dangerous." She hadn't understood then. She was beginning to now. Marcus Collins' memorial service was scheduled for 2:01 p.m. at Arlington National Cemetery. By 1:30, mourners had begun to gather, a sea of dress blues and formal attire beneath a sky that threatened rain without delivering. The perfect metaphor, Olivia thought, for promises of change that never materialized. She sat alone in her government vehicle, watching the proceedings from a distance. Protocol dictated that she arrive last, but Olivia had always preferred to assess situations before entering them. 20 years as one of the few black women at her rank had taught her the value of reconnaissance. Through the windshield, she observed Lieutenant Sullivan directing the security detail with precise, economical gestures. His movements were fluid, confident, the physical grammar of someone accustomed to authority. He positioned his men at the perimeter, with careful attention to sightlines and escape routes. Professional, thorough. Nothing in his demeanor suggested the concerns raised in his psychological evaluation. Yet something in his posture changed subtly when Colonel Monroe approached him. A straightening of the spine, a slight inclination of the head, the unconscious tells of someone receiving guidance from a mentor rather than orders from a superior. Olivia's phone buzzed with an incoming message. "They're moving pieces into position. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Not everyone here is mourning Marcus. Some are celebrating." The text came from an unknown number, but Olivia could guess its source. Marcus had maintained a network of enlisted personnel who shared his concerns about the institutional rot they'd witnessed. They called themselves the Underground, a deliberately dramatic name for what amounted to a whisper network of watchdogs. She didn't respond to the text. Better to leave no digital trail. Instead, she took a deep breath, checked her uniform in the rearview mirror, and opened the car door. The ceremonial detail snapped to attention as she approached. All except Sullivan, who maintained his position by the podium, watching her approach with the clinical interest of someone studying an unusual specimen. "General Washington," he said, offering a salute that was technically correct but somehow hollow. "We've been expecting you." "Lieutenant Sullivan," she replied, returning the salute with perfect form. I appreciate your attention to security today. Just following orders, ma'am. His voice was neutral, but something in his eyes shifted a momentary flash of something like resentment. Though I must admit I wasn't aware of your personal connection to Sergeant Collins. The emphasis was subtle but unmistakable, an insinuation wrapped in professionalism. Sergeant Collins saved my life in Kandahar, Olivia said simply. He earned my respect and my gratitude. That's all the connection needed for a proper farewell. Sullivan nodded, his expression unchanged. Of course, General. If you'll follow me, we've reserved a place for you in the front row. As they walked toward the seating area, Olivia noticed a small group of civilians standing apart from the military personnel. A woman holding the hand of a young boy in a miniature Marine dress uniform caught her eye. The boy's resemblance to Marcus was unmistakable, the same warm brown eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. Marcus's sister and nephew, Sullivan explained, following her gaze. The boy idolized his uncle, wants to be a Marine when he grows up. Something in Sullivan's tone made Olivia glance at him sharply. There was a dismissiveness there, a subtle contempt. The Collins family has a proud tradition of service, she said evenly. 3 generations of Marines. Yes, Sullivan replied. Quite remarkable for their demographic. The comment hung in the air between them, a deliberate provocation wrapped in plausible deniability. Olivia let it pass unanswered. Today was about Marcus, not about engaging with Sullivan's baiting. As they reached the front row, Sullivan gestured to an empty seat. Your place, General. Olivia remained standing. I'll wait until the family is seated, Lieutenant. Protocol. Sullivan's jaw tightened momentarily before he nodded and moved away to continue organizing the security detail. Olivia watched him go, noting how he positioned himself near the podium, where she would eventually speak, a location that gave him clear sightlines to both her and the exit routes. The minutes ticked by as more mourners arrived. Olivia recognized faces from throughout Marcus's career, fellow Marines, Pentagon officials, even a few politicians who had worked with him on Veterans Affairs initiatives. But she also noticed unfamiliar faces watching the proceedings with detached interest, men in plain suits with military posture and assessing eyes. Not mourners, observers. At precisely 2:00 p.m., the ceremony began. The chaplain stepped forward to offer opening words as Marcus's family took their seats in the front row. Olivia remained standing at the back, her presence acknowledged with respectful nods from those who recognized her. The ceremonial detail presented the flag while the chaplain spoke of sacrifice and service. Marcus's sister wept silently, her shoulders shaking beneath her black dress. The boy Jamal, Olivia remembered, sat perfectly straight, mimicking the posture of the Marines around him. When the time came for personal remembrances, Sullivan approached Olivia with a clipboard. You're listed as the primary speaker, General, though there seems to be some confusion about the protocol here. Your name wasn't on the original program. Sergeant Collins left specific instructions? Olivia replied, handing him a folded paper from her pocket. His written request that I speak at his memorial. Sullivan examined the paper with a frown. This isn't an official document. It's handwritten. It's a dying wish, Lieutenant. That supersedes paperwork. For a moment, Sullivan seemed about to object, but Colonel Monroe appeared at his side, whispering something in his ear. Sullivan's expression hardened, but he nodded and stepped aside. After you, General. Olivia moved toward the podium, conscious of the weight of the wooden box in her hands and the eyes following her progress. As she passed the front row, young Jamal looked up at her with solemn recognition. You're the lady from Uncle Marcus's stories, he whispered, the one who wasn't afraid of anything. The simple statement nearly broke her composure more than any military formality could have. Olivia nodded to him, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. At the podium, she placed Marcus's ashes beside the framed photograph of him in full dress uniform. His smile, captured in that official portrait, seemed diminished somehow, the vibrant spirit she'd known reduced to a formal representation that missed the essence of the man. Sergeant Marcus Collins, she began, her voice carrying across the cemetery without need for amplification. Understood that a uniform doesn't make a soldier, character does. From her peripheral vision, she noticed Sullivan shifting his position, moving closer to the podium. A subtle movement, but enough to trigger her combat-honed instincts. Marcus served with distinction for 18 years, she continued, but his greatest service wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the quiet moments afterward when he refused to look away from truths others found inconvenient. A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the standard eulogy they had expected, platitudes about duty and sacrifice. Olivia was veering into territory rarely acknowledged at official ceremonies. 3 weeks before his death, Marcus contacted me about systemic issues. He had documented patterns of discrimination and retaliation within our ranks. His accident occurred the day after he submitted his formal report. The murmur grew louder. Sullivan had moved even closer, his hand now resting near his holster. Behind him, Colonel Monroe's face had gone carefully blank. Marcus once told me, Olivia continued, her voice steady, despite the tension building around her. Honor isn't born from medals. It comes from the moments when you refuse to back down, when someone points a gun at your chest. As if summoned by her words, Sullivan stepped forward, his expression transformed by a cold fury that seemed to have been waiting just beneath the surface. General Washington, he said, his voice carrying clearly, I need to see your authorization for this ceremony. The request was so unexpected, so out of protocol, that a confused silence fell over the gathering. Olivia regarded him with calm assessment. Lieutenant, this is a memorial service, not a security checkpoint. Stand down. Sullivan's face flushed. Your credentials, General. Now. Behind him, several of his security detail exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't standard procedure for any ceremony, much less a memorial service for a decorated veteran. Lieutenant Sullivan, Colonel Monroe said quietly, this isn't the appropriate... With respect, sir, Sullivan cut him off. I have concerns about the legitimacy of the General's presence here. We've had reports of unauthorized personnel attempting to access restricted ceremonies. The absurdity of the claim hung in the air. A lieutenant general in full-dress uniform, known to everyone present, being challenged at a ceremony she was invited to lead. Olivia understood with perfect clarity what was happening. This wasn't about authorization. This was about public humiliation, a power play designed to diminish her authority before witnesses. Lieutenant Sullivan, she said, her voice quiet but carrying, you are out of line. Something in Sullivan snapped. He strode forward, reaching for the framed photograph of Marcus. This ceremony is suspended pending verification of all participants. Before anyone could react, he swept the photograph off the podium. The frame crashed to the ground glass, shattering across the ceremonial space. Gasps erupted from the mourners. Marcus's sister half rose from her seat, a cry escaping her lips. And then Sullivan drew his service weapon, pointing it directly at Olivia's chest. You don't belong here, he said, his voice trembling with an emotion too complex to name. You never did. Time seemed to stop. Security personnel reached for their weapons, but hesitated, uncertain who to target in this unprecedented scenario. Colonel Monroe stood frozen, his carefully constructed political world collapsing before his eyes. In that suspended moment, a piece of paper fluttered from Olivia's pocket, dislodged when Sullivan had brushed against her to reach the photograph. It drifted to the ground between them, landing face up on the shattered glass. Written in Marcus's distinctive hand were the words, If I die, let her speak my goodbye. Her voice once kept me alive. Young Jamal's voice cut through the terrible silence. Why is that man afraid of her mama? The question, innocent, profound, seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. A ripple of awareness passed through the witnesses, forcing them to see the scene as the child saw it, not through the lens of rank or protocol, but as a raw display of fear confronting dignity. Olivia hadn't moved. She stood perfectly still, eyes locked with Sullivan's, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of her fear. In that moment, she wasn't just standing her ground for herself or for Marcus. She was standing for Jamal, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Put down the weapon, Lieutenant, came a new voice, steady, authoritative. Colonel Foster, a white officer who had served with Marcus years earlier, had stepped forward from the crowd. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. This isn't who we are, Foster continued, moving slowly toward Sullivan. This isn't what the uniform stands for. Sullivan's hand trembled slightly, but the gun remained pointed at Olivia. You don't understand what's happening here, Colonel. They're replacing us, changing the rules, telling us our service doesn't matter anymore. No one is replacing anyone, Foster said calmly. Lower your weapon, son. Whatever you're feeling right now, this isn't the answer. For a heartbeat, it seemed Sullivan might actually comply. Something in Foster's steadiness reached past the rage to the frightened man beneath. But then his gaze fell on Jamal, the boy in his miniature uniform watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes, and his expression hardened once more. They'll make him a general someday, Sullivan said, nodding toward Jamal. Not because he earned it, because they need more faces that look like his in the photographs. That's enough, Lieutenant, Olivia said, her voice cutting through his rhetoric like a blade. Your quarrel is with me. Leave the child out of it. As if her words had broken some invisible barrier, chaos erupted at the perimeter of the ceremony. Military police appeared suddenly, weapons drawn, moving with practiced efficiency toward Sullivan. Sullivan's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in bitter understanding. You knew, he said to Olivia. You were expecting this. I knew something was wrong when your name appeared on the security detail, she replied evenly. The rest was basic precaution. The MPs surrounded Sullivan, their weapons trained on him, with unwavering focus. Drop the gun, Lieutenant, their commander ordered. This ends now. For one terrible moment, Sullivan's finger tightened on the trigger. Olivia saw the decision forming in his eyes, the desperate calculation of a man who believes he has nothing left to lose. Your choice defines you, she said quietly for his ears alone. Not your fear. Something in her words reached him. The gun lowered slowly, not in surrender, but in a strange, grudging acknowledgement. As the MPs moved in to restrain him, Sullivan's gaze remained locked with Olivia's. This isn't over, he said as they secured his weapon and applied handcuffs. I'm just the first. There are more of us than you think. As they led him away, one of the MPs discovered a folded paper in Sullivan's pocket, a list of names under the heading, Targets for Correction. Every name belonged to an officer of color. Olivia's name was circled in red ink at the top. But more disturbing than the list itself was what happened as Sullivan was escorted past the gathered mourners. One of the officers, a major Olivia didn't recognize, gave Sullivan a nearly imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a silent message of solidarity that sent a chill through Olivia's core. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom. The ceremony resumed after a 30-minute delay, continuing with a subdued solemnity that couldn't fully mask the tension lingering in the air. Olivia completed her eulogy, speaking words of remembrance for Marcus that carefully avoided direct mention of the disruption. But everyone present understood that something fundamental had changed. A veil had been pulled aside, revealing ugliness that could no longer be ignored. After the final salute, as mourners began to disperse, Colonel Foster approached Olivia. His expression was grave, his shoulders carrying a new weight. I've served for 32 years, he said without preamble. I've told myself that things were getting better, that incidents like this were anomalies. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. It's not your burden to carry alone, Colonel, Olivia replied. With respect, General, it is. Foster's gaze was direct, unflinching. My silence has been complicity. I've seen the signs, the jokes in the officers' mess, the passed-over promotions, the assignments that never quite materialized for certain personnel. I told myself it wasn't my place to speak up. He glanced toward where Sullivan had been taken away. That man didn't appear from nowhere. He was created by a system that whispers instead of shouts, that uses code instead of clarity. And I've been part of that system. Before Olivia could respond, Marcus's sister approached with Jamal. The boy's earlier composure had given way to confusion, his eyes darting nervously toward the spot where the confrontation had occurred. Uncle Marcus said you were the bravest person he knew, Jamal said to Olivia, his voice small but determined. He said you never let the bad guys win. The simple faith in his words struck Olivia with physical force. How could she explain to this child that bad guys rarely announce themselves with convenient labels, that sometimes they wore the same uniform as the good guys, attended the same briefings, saluted the same flag? Your uncle was the brave one, she said instead, kneeling to meet Jamal at eye level. And you know what made him special? He didn't just fight when everyone was watching. He fought when no one was looking. Jamal considered this with solemn intensity. Is that why the man with the gun was scared of you? Because you fight when no one's looking. From the mouths of children, Olivia thought. The piercing clarity that adults work so hard to obscure with complexity. Yes, she answered honestly. That's exactly why. As Jamal and his mother moved away, Colonel Monroe appeared at Olivia's side. His face was a mask of professional concern, but his eyes were calculating. A regrettable incident, he said smoothly. Lieutenant Sullivan will face a full psychological evaluation and appropriate disciplinary action. I want to assure you, General, that his views do not reflect the values of our institution. Don't they? Olivia asked quietly. Monroe's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, enough to reveal the cold assessment beneath his practiced concern. I would caution against drawing broad conclusions from an isolated event, General, particularly in the current political climate. This wasn't isolated, and we both know it, Olivia replied. Sullivan's psychological evaluation 3 years ago flagged concerns about racial bias, yet he was reinstated under your authority. He was assigned to security for a ceremony honoring a black Marine who died under questionable circumstances. These aren't coincidences, Colonel. Monroe's expression hardened. Be careful, General. Allegations without evidence can damage careers, even decorated ones. Is that a threat? A reality check. Monroe straightened his uniform with practiced precision. The military isn't a platform for social justice crusades. It's about readiness, about America's security interests. Everything else is a distraction. As he walked away, Olivia noticed a small recording device clipped to Jamal's miniature uniform, a standard-issue body cam that had captured the entire confrontation with Sullivan, including Monroe's thinly veiled threat. The boy's mother caught Olivia's gaze and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The underground was more organized than Olivia had realized. Marcus's network had anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. By nightfall, footage of Sullivan pointing his weapon at a decorated black female general during a veterans memorial service had spread across social media and news networks. The Pentagon's carefully constructed image of progress, inequality, lay in shambles, exposed by 3 minutes of unfiltered reality. In her apartment that evening, Olivia sat alone with Marcus's medal, a Bronze Star he'd received for the action that saved her life in Kandahar. She'd kept it safe for him while he was hospitalized for his injuries. Now it was hers to preserve along with his memory. Her phone buzzed with messages from reporters, seeking comments from fellow officers, offering support from politicians, sensing an opportunity. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing a formal request for a military tribunal to investigate not just Sullivan's actions, but the system that had enabled him. As she worked, a single line from Marcus's last message to her kept repeating in her mind, "Honor isn't about the medals on your chest. It's about standing tall when the gun is pointed at your heart." Outside her window, Washington, D.C. glittered with the false promise of power without consequence. Tomorrow the real battle would begin, not with weapons but with truth. A truth that had been building pressure beneath the surface for generations, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. Sullivan had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Pentagon war room hummed with the low-frequency tension of carefully managed crisis. 5 screens displayed different news networks, all showing the same footage on repeat. Lieutenant Sullivan, pointing his service weapon at General Olivia Washington during Sergeant Collins' memorial service. The timestamp in the corner less than 6 hours ago felt like a lifetime. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Richard Hayes paced the length of the table, his reflection ghosting across the polished surface. Behind him, representatives from each military branch sat in uncomfortable silence, waiting for someone to state the obvious. "This is a containment situation," Hayes finally said, his voice controlled but strained. "We need to get ahead of the narrative before civilian oversight committees start asking questions we can't answer." "With respect, sir," Olivia said from her position at the far end of the table, "containment isn't the appropriate response. What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. It was symptomatic." Every head turned toward her. As the only person of color in the room and the subject of the footage playing on endless loop behind them, her words carried a weight that made the assembled brass visibly uncomfortable. "General Washington," Hayes replied, choosing his words with diplomatic precision, "no one is disputing the seriousness of Lieutenant Sullivan's actions. He'll face court-martial and dishonorable discharge. But we need to frame this correctly as the actions of one disturbed individual, not as a reflection on the institution. Olivia met his gaze steadily. And if it is a reflection on the institution? The silence that followed was deafening. Admiral Green, a silver-haired veteran of 3 administrations, cleared his throat. Let's be clear about what we're discussing, he said. Are you suggesting, General Washington, that the United States military, the most diverse fighting force in the world, has a systemic racism problem? Based on the actions of one lieutenant, I'm suggesting, Olivia replied, that Lieutenant Sullivan's psychological evaluation 3 years ago explicitly noted concerns about racial bias. That evaluation was overridden by Colonel Monroe. Sullivan was then assigned to security detail for a memorial service honoring a Black Marine who died under circumstances that deserve further investigation. These are not coincidences. You're implying conspiracy, General Mitchell said, leaning forward with barely concealed hostility. That's an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. Olivia reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed folder. This contains Sergeant Collins' final report submitted 3 weeks before his death. It documents 18 cases of discriminatory treatment against personnel of color across 4 bases. It includes names, dates, and corroborating testimony. She placed the folder on the table and slid it toward Hayes. The day after he submitted this report, Sergeant Collins died in what was classified as a training accident. The original investigation files were sealed under national security protocols, typically reserved for covert operations. That's standard procedure for certain training exercises, Mitchell interjected. For a rappelling exercise at Fort Benning, Olivia countered. There was nothing classified about the training Sergeant Collins was conducting. Yet the witness statements disappeared from the official record, and the investigation was closed within 48 hours. Hayes picked up the folder but didn't open it. General Washington, these are serious allegations. If you've been withholding evidence in an active military investigation. I haven't been withholding anything, sir. That report was submitted through proper channels 3 weeks before Marcus died. It vanished from the system. What you're holding is Marcus's personal copy, which he entrusted to me the last time we spoke. The room fell silent again as the implications settled over the assembled officers. On the screens behind them, Sullivan's face froze in a moment of hatred as news anchors debated whether the incident represented a larger pattern or an aberration. This stays in this room, Hayes finally said, tucking the folder under his arm. I'll review the report personally and determine appropriate next steps. In the meantime, General Washington, you'll be placed on administrative leave. Administrative leave. Olivia's voice remained level, but her posture straightened imperceptibly. On what grounds? For your protection, Hayes replied smoothly. You've experienced a traumatic event. The Pentagon wants to ensure you have appropriate time to recover before resuming your duties. The euphemism hung in the air, transparent in its real intent removal from public view until the story lost momentum, silencing through bureaucracy. With respect, sir, I decline. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. One did not simply decline an order from the Joint Chiefs Chairman. That wasn't a request, General, Hayes said, his tone hardening. Neither was mine, Olivia replied. I have the right to request a formal investigation into both Sergeant Collins' death and today's security breach at Arlington. I'm exercising that right effective immediately. Admiral Green exchanged glances with General Mitchell. This wasn't proceeding according to plan. Olivia, Hayes said, dropping military formality in an attempt to establish personal connection. We all want the same thing here, to protect the integrity of the institution we've devoted our lives to. Taking this public risks, damaging the military standing with the American people at a critical time. Such firm. With respect, sir, what damages our standing isn't acknowledging our flaws. It's pretending they don't exist. Before Hayes could respond, the door opened and a junior officer entered with a tablet. He whispered something to Hayes, whose expression darkened as he viewed whatever was displayed on the screen. It seems, Hayes said after dismissing the officer, that our containment options have narrowed considerably. He turned the tablet so everyone could see. On screen was a live stream from outside the Pentagon. Hundreds of people had gathered, many in military uniforms, holding signs with Marcus Collins' face and the words, "Tell the truth." The footage from Arlington has been viewed 17 million times in the last 4 hours. Hayes continued. Every major news outlet is running the story. Congressional oversight committees are calling for emergency hearings. He fixed Olivia with a calculating stare. This feels coordinated, General. Not by me, she replied truthfully. But Sergeant Collins had many friends who believed in his mission. It appears they're continuing his work. The implications hung in the air. Marcus Collins had built a network, a movement that extended beyond his death. The underground wasn't just a whisper network. It was an organized resistance. I need everything you know about Collins's associates, Hayes demanded. With respect, sir, I'm not in a position to provide that information. Olivia's voice remained professional, but her resolve was unmistakable. What I can offer is a path forward that addresses legitimate concerns while preserving the institution's core values. A transparent investigation conducted by an independent panel with the findings made public. Out of the question, Mitchell snapped. Military affairs remain under military jurisdiction. Then we prepare for civilian oversight to step in, Olivia replied, because this story isn't going away. And from what I can see, she gestured toward the tablet showing the growing crowd, neither are those who demand answers. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're playing a dangerous game, General Washington. It's not a game to me, sir. It never has been. The meeting ended without resolution, each officer retreating to their respective corners of influence to assess damage and calculate next moves. As Olivia gathered her materials, Admiral Green approached her privately. You've forced their hand, he said quietly. They'll retaliate. You understand that, don't you? I expected nothing less, Olivia replied. Green glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Washington, I've served for 42 years. I've seen changes, real ones. But what you're pushing for? There are power structures in place that won't yield without a fight. Then it's a fight they'll get. Green's weathered face creased with concern. Just be careful. Men like Mitchell and Monroe don't view this as a policy disagreement. They see it as an existential threat. To what? To a worldview where their authority is natural and unquestionable. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Sullivan was a symptom. Look deeper for the disease. James Sullivan sat alone in a military holding cell, hands folded in his lap, expression eerily serene for a man facing court-martial. The walls were institutional gray, the lighting harsh and unforgiving. A camera in the corner recorded his every movement. When the door opened, he didn't look up immediately. He knew who it would be. You're in serious trouble, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe said, remaining standing as the door closed behind him. Am I? Sullivan's voice was calm, almost detached. Or am I exactly where I'm supposed to be? Monroe checked his watch, a gesture of impatience, but also a verification that they had precisely 3 minutes before the surveillance recording would loop, creating a window of unmonitored conversation. A technological convenience arranged by sympathetic IT personnel. You weren't supposed to draw your weapon, Monroe said, his voice low and tight. The plan was to challenge her authority, create a scene, not threaten her life on camera. Sullivan finally looked up, his blue eyes startlingly clear. Plans evolve based on battlefield conditions, sir. You taught me that. This wasn't a battlefield. Everything is a battlefield now, Sullivan replied. They've made it that way. Every promotion, every policy, every history lesson is a contested space. I just made the conflict visible. Monroe's jaw tightened. You've compromised years of careful positioning. The network we've built, the network is stronger than you think. Sullivan leaned forward slightly. What happened at Arlington today wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The confidence in his voice gave Monroe pause. Explain. 17 officers have already contacted sympathizers expressing support for my actions. Not publicly, of course, but the message is spreading. Someone finally had the courage to stand up. Stand up for what exactly? Monroe asked, genuinely curious about Sullivan's perspective. For meritocracy, for standards that don't bend to political pressure, for the warrior ethos that built this military before it became a social engineering project. Sullivan's voice grew animated, revealing the passion beneath his controlled exterior. Washington wasn't promoted because she was the best qualified. She was promoted because she checks demographic boxes that make civilian oversight committees feel progressive. Monroe studied him carefully. You actually believe that, don't you? Despite her combat record, Despite her Purple Heart and Bronze Star, medals can be awarded for political reasons, Sullivan said dismissively. You know that better than anyone. For a moment, something like doubt flickered across Monroe's face, a momentary recognition that the ideology he had nurtured in Sullivan and others had evolved into something he couldn't fully control. The hearing will be closed to the public, Monroe said, redirecting the conversation. Your mental health will be the central focus: PTSD, stress-induced psychosis. You'll serve minimal time, and provisions will be made for your future. Sullivan smiled thinly. I don't need provisions, Colonel. I need vindication, and I'll get it at the hearing. What does that mean? Monroe asked, a note of alarm entering his voice. It means I'm not the only one who's going to be exposed when I take the stand. Sullivan's eyes gleamed with unsettling intensity. I kept records, Colonel. Conversations, meetings, names of every officer who shared our concerns about the direction of the military under the current diversity mandate. Monroe felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. You were never authorized to. I wasn't authorized to do a lot of things, Sullivan interrupted, but you encouraged them anyway, because they served your purpose. The surveillance camera in the corner blinked once their signal that recording would resume in 30 seconds. Think carefully about your next steps, Lieutenant, Monroe said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're playing a game with rules you don't fully understand. Sullivan leaned back, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. I understand enough, sir. I understand that men like you want the benefits of the system we're building without the responsibility of being visibly connected to it. You want plausible deniability. The camera light steadied, indicating normal recording had resumed. I'll ensure your rights are protected through the legal process, Lieutenant, Monroe said loudly for the record. The military takes care of its own. As he turned to leave, Sullivan called after him. One question, sir? Monroe paused at the door. Do you think she was afraid? When I pointed the gun at her? The question hung in the air, revealing more about Sullivan's psychology than any evaluation could have. He hadn't drawn his weapon in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He had wanted to see fear in Olivia Washington's eyes, needed to see it as validation of his worldview. No, Lieutenant, Monroe answered truthfully. I don't think she was afraid at all. The door closed behind him, leaving Sullivan alone with an expression of frustrated purpose. He hadn't seen fear in Washington's eyes, only steady resolve, and that more than anything had fueled his hatred. In her Pentagon office, Olivia sorted through the files she would need for the coming days. Administrative leave might be imminent, and she had no intention of being caught unprepared. On her desk, her phone buzzed continuously with messages from journalists seeking comments from fellow officers, offering support, or distancing themselves from politicians, sensing opportunity in crisis. She ignored them all, focusing instead on assembling the evidence Marcus had collected before his death. The official copy might have vanished from military records, but Marcus had been methodical in creating backups, documentation of 18 cases where personnel of color had faced retribution after reporting discrimination. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. She looked up to find Major Diane Chen, her administrative aide, standing in the doorway with an expression of barely contained urgency. You need to see this, General, Chen said, entering and closing the door behind her. She placed a tablet on Olivia's desk. On screen was an internal military messaging board, one typically used for routine administrative communications. But there was nothing routine about the current thread. Under the innocuous heading, Protocol Review Discussion, dozens of officers were exchanging views on the Arlington incident. Most troubling weren't the comments supporting Sullivan, those were expected, but the volume of participants in their ranks. Majors, colonels, even a brigadier general expressing sentiments that stopped just short of endorsing Sullivan's actions while questioning Olivia's agenda. Washington has been pushing boundaries since her promotion to general. Arlington was inevitable. The question no one's asking: why was Collins's death getting special treatment? How many white sergeants get eulogized by lieutenant generals? This isn't about race, it's about standards. Some people advance because of merit, others because of mandates. Everyone knows the difference. The euphemisms were carefully constructed to maintain plausible deniability while conveying clear meaning to the intended audience. How widespread is this? Olivia asked. This particular board has over 200 active participants, Chen replied, all officer level, all using official military communication channels, which means they're either incredibly confident or incredibly reckless. Or they believe they have protection from the highest levels. Olivia added, scrolling through more comments. Has there been any official response from Pentagon leadership? Nothing beyond the standard incident under investigation statement. But there's something else you should know. Chen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The surveillance footage from Sullivan's holding cell had a 3-minute gap earlier today. During that time, Colonel Monroe paid him a visit. Olivia looked up sharply. How do you know this? I have contacts in military intelligence who are concerned about certain patterns they've observed. The underground, Olivia said, connecting the dots. Chen nodded once, neither confirming nor denying explicit involvement. What matters is that Sullivan isn't acting alone. He's part of something larger, something with enough influence to manipulate security protocols and access restricted areas. Olivia considered this information, its implications, expanding like ripples in still water. They'll try to control the narrative at the hearing, frame Sullivan as mentally unstable, his actions as isolated. Most likely, Chen agreed, but there's a complication they haven't anticipated. She reached into her uniform pocket and removed a small data drive. This contains Marcus Collins' complete investigation files, including evidence that wasn't in the report he submitted officially. What kind of evidence? Audio recordings, correspondence, documentation of a network within military leadership that systematically undermined the advancement of personnel from marginalized backgrounds. Marcus called it the gatekeepers officers who maintain the appearance of supporting diversity while actively working to preserve traditional power structures. Olivia took the drive, its weight in her palm, insignificant compared to the burden it represented. Why didn't Marcus include this in his official report? He was building a case carefully, methodically. The official report contained claims that could be verified through military records. This, Chen nodded toward the drive, contains the why behind those incidents, the pattern, the intent. And the names, Olivia added, understanding blooming. The connective tissue between seemingly isolated incidents. Chen nodded. Marcus believed exposure was coming. That's why they... She stopped abruptly. That's why they killed him, Olivia finished for her. The words hung in the air between them, crossing a threshold from suspicion to stated belief. I can't confirm that, General, Chen said carefully, but the timing was significant. Olivia slipped the drive into her pocket. Have you reviewed the contents? Some. Enough to understand why Marcus was concerned. Chen straightened her posture, a subtle shift from aide to soldier. General, I should tell you my name appears in Sullivan's list. Number 7. The information landed with quiet impact. Chen wasn't just passing along intelligence. She was personally implicated in whatever was unfolding. Why? Olivia asked simply. I established the Asian American Military Officers Association last year. We advocate for greater recognition of Asian American contributions to military history and mentor younger personnel. Sullivan and others viewed this as identity politics infiltrating command structure. Haha. The absurdity might have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. Cultural celebration reframed as subversion, heritage as threat. Does anyone else know you have this drive? Olivia asked. 3 others, all members of Marcus's network, all on Sullivan's list. Olivia made a decision. I need you to take temporary leave effective immediately, unofficial. Go somewhere without digital footprints. Chen's expression didn't change, but her eyes registered understanding. You're expecting retaliation. I'm expecting escalation, Olivia corrected. What happened at Arlington was a fracture point. Systems under pressure don't heal fractures, they expand from them. And you think they'll target those connected to you. I know they will. Sullivan's list is just the beginning. They'll look for pressure points, vulnerabilities, ways to isolate those pushing for change. Olivia's gaze was steady. I need people I trust to be positioned outside the system when that happens. Chen nodded once, accepting the assignment without further question. What will you do with the drive? Make copies. Secure them in multiple locations. Then use the contents strategically. Olivia glanced at the tablet still displaying the message board. They've been building their network in shadows. It's time to bring it into the light. After Chen departed, Olivia locked her office door and inserted the drive into her secure laptop. The files were organized with military precision dates, locations, personnel involved. Marcus had been thorough in his documentation, creating an undeniable pattern that stretched back years. Most revealing weren't the individual incidents of discrimination, but the consistent response from command when such incidents were reported, transfers of the complainants, sudden changes in performance, evaluations assignment to remote postings or dangerous deployments. The system hadn't failed to address discrimination, it had actively protected it. Among the files was a video, the last one Marcus had recorded before his death. Olivia hesitated before playing it, steeling herself to hear his voice again. Marcus appeared on screen in his quarters, his expression grave but determined. He wore his uniform as if the formality of the message demanded it. Liv! He began using the nickname only he had been permitted to use. If you're watching this, something's happened to me. I've sent copies of my findings to 3 people I trust absolutely, with instructions to deliver them to you if necessary. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a gesture Olivia recognized as his way of organizing thoughts under pressure. What I've uncovered goes beyond individual acts of prejudice. There's an organized effort to maintain what they call traditional leadership demographics within the military. They operate through unofficial channels, identifying promising officers from marginalized backgrounds and finding ways to derail their careers before they reach positions of real influence. Marcus leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping as if concerned about being overheard despite being alone. They call themselves the guardians, defenders of military tradition against what they see as political correctness. But their real agenda is preservation of power. They target anyone they perceive as a threat to that power structure: women, people of color, LGBTQ personnel, anyone who challenges the narrative that effective military leadership looks and thinks a certain way. He paused, conflict visible in his expression. I've identified 27 officers involved in this network, including 3 generals and 7 colonels. The evidence is circumstantial, but compelling patterns of communication, personnel decisions, security clearance delays, all targeting specific demographics. Marcus looked directly into the camera, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and resignation. I'm submitting an official report tomorrow through proper channels, but I've removed the names of high-ranking officers, pending more conclusive evidence. That evidence is in this drive recording's correspondence testimony from affected personnel. He took a deep breath. Liv, I know what I'm asking of you by sharing this. They'll come after you too. But you're the only one with the position and the courage to break this open. He hesitated, a rare moment of vulnerability. Be careful. These people believe they're protecting the soul of the military. That makes them dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with combat training. The video ended with Marcus offering a formal salute, a gesture that, coming from him to her, represented not just military protocol, but profound respect between equals. Olivia sat in silence. After the screen went dark, the weight of Marcus's final request settling around her shoulders like a familiar burden. This wasn't just about justice for one sergeant or accountability for one lieutenant. It was about confronting a system that had evolved to protect itself from change while maintaining the appearance of progress. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number: hearing scheduled. 0900 tomorrow. Closed session. S has legal counsel from outside military. Watch your 6. The underground was still operational, still feeding her intelligence. That meant Marcus's network remained intact despite his death, a testament to how thoroughly he had built his resistance. Olivia began preparing for the hearing, knowing it would be less a search for truth than a battlefield where narrative would determine victory. Sullivan's actions had created a moment of visibility, a brief window where the usually invisible structures of power had been exposed. Her job now was to keep that window from closing before real change could enter. As night fell over, the Pentagon lights burned in offices across the complex as factions mobilized for the coming confrontation. In the military intelligence wing, analysts pored over social media reactions to the Arlington incident, identifying patterns of response and potential security concerns. In the Judge Advocate General's offices, legal teams constructed arguments around Sullivan's mental state and fitness for duty frameworks designed to contain the incident's implications. And in a secure conference room on the building's top floor, the Joint Chiefs met in emergency session, their discussion unrecorded by official minutes. The question before them wasn't whether to address what had happened, but how to ensure the addressing itself didn't become more dangerous than the original wound. Dawn broke over Washington, D.C., painting the Pentagon's imposing structure in shades of amber and gold. Outside the main entrance, a small group of protesters had maintained vigil through the night. Veterans, mostly standing in silent formation, with signs bearing Marcus Collins' face and the words that had become a rallying cry: "Tell the truth." Inside, Olivia moved through security checkpoints with practiced efficiency, her dress uniform immaculate, her expression revealing nothing of the sleepless night spent reviewing evidence and preparing strategy. Personnel she passed in the hallways either nodded with respect or averted their eyes, a visual representation of the dividing lines forming within the institution. The hearing room was smaller than she had expected, an intentional choice to limit attendance. 3 senior officers sat at the front: Admiral Green, General Mitchell, and a Marine Corps general Olivia recognized as Robert Hansen, known for his by-the-book approach to military justice. No civilian oversight, no press, no recording devices beyond the official stenographer. Sullivan was already seated at a table to the right, dressed in his uniform, despite his detention status, another calculated visual message. Beside him sat not a military JAG officer, but a civilian attorney in an expensive suit, his presence an anomaly in a closed military proceeding. Colonel Monroe sat directly behind Sullivan, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly as Olivia entered, and in that moment she recognized something she hadn't fully appreciated before. Monroe wasn't just protecting the system, he believed in it with religious conviction. General Hansen called the room to order with a sharp rap of his knuckles on the table. This preliminary hearing will address the events at Arlington National Cemetery on May 27, 2025, involving Lieutenant James Sullivan and Lieutenant General Olivia Washington. This is not a court-martial, but an evidentiary proceeding to determine appropriate next steps. He turned to Sullivan. "Lieutenant, you have been informed of your rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Do you understand these rights?" "Yes, sir," Sullivan replied, his voice steady. "For the record, please state your name and current assignment." Sullivan sat straighter almost imperceptibly. "Lieutenant James Sullivan, Pentagon Security Detail, assigned under Colonel William Monroe." Hansen nodded. "General Washington, for the record, please state your name and current assignment." "Lieutenant General Olivia Washington, Strategic Operations Command, Pentagon." "Thank you." Hansen shuffled papers before him. "This hearing will proceed as follows. We will review the factual sequence of events at Arlington, hear statements from both parties, and determine whether this matter should proceed to court-martial or be resolved through administrative action." Sullivan's attorney leaned forward. "General, before we begin, I'd like to enter into the record that my client has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from his service in Afghanistan. Medical documentation has been submitted to the panel." Olivia noted the strategy, immediately laying groundwork for a mental health defense to transform an act of calculated aggression into a moment of trauma-induced confusion. "So noted," Hansen replied. "Though I must point out, Counselor, that Lieutenant Sullivan has never served in a combat zone. His file indicates administrative postings throughout his career." A flicker of discomfort crossed the attorney's face. "The diagnosis relates to secondary trauma, General. Lieutenant Sullivan has worked closely with returning combat veterans and has absorbed their experiences through his support role." The explanation was thin, almost transparently so, but Hansen merely nodded. "Noted for the record. Now let's proceed with—" "Sir," Olivia interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to enter a formal request that this hearing be open to appropriate civilian oversight. Given the public nature of the incident and its broader implications for military culture, transparency would better serve the interests of justice." General Mitchell's expression darkened. "This is an internal military matter, General Washington. Civilian involvement would compromise operational security." "What operational security concerns arise from addressing an incident at a public cemetery during a memorial service, sir?" Olivia asked the question, landing with precision. "That's not the point." Mitchell replied, his tone sharpening. Military discipline remains under military jurisdiction. Admiral Green cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus first on establishing the facts of the incident before determining appropriate protocols for the full hearing. Olivia recognized the deflection but didn't press further. Better to pick her battles strategically. Very well, Hansen said. Let's begin with a review of the security footage from Arlington. A screen descended from the ceiling, and the room darkened slightly as video began to play. The footage was higher quality than Olivia had expected, capturing not just the confrontation itself, but the minutes leading up to it. Sullivan could be seen positioning himself near the podium, communicating via earpiece with someone off camera, his attention focused on Olivia with unsettling intensity. As the video progressed to the moment when Sullivan swept Marcus's photograph from the podium and drew his weapon, Olivia noticed Mitchell's expression, not shock or dismay, but careful assessment, as if evaluating a tactical maneuver. When the footage concluded, Hansen turned to Sullivan. Lieutenant, would you care to explain your actions as captured in this video? Sullivan's attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Sullivan shook it off, leaning forward with a certainty that suggested rehearsal. Sir, I was acting on information that suggested a security breach at the ceremony. I had received intelligence indicating General Washington's presence might be associated with a demonstration aimed at undermining military protocols. What intelligence? Hansen asked. From what source? Sullivan hesitated, glancing briefly at Monroe. I'm not at liberty to disclose my sources, sir. They involve sensitive channels. Lieutenant, this is a formal hearing. You don't have the authority to withhold information based on sensitivity. Sullivan's expression hardened slightly. Sir, I was following established protocols for situations involving potential security risks to high-ranking personnel. My training dictates that when uncertain protection of the ceremony's integrity takes precedence over procedural niceties. Drawing your weapon on a superior officer goes well beyond procedural niceties, Lieutenant, Admiral Green observed dryly. Sir, with respect, I perceived an imminent threat to the sanctity of a military ceremony. General Washington was using her position to advance a personal agenda, using Sergeant Collins' death as a platform for political statements that had no place at Arlington. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Sullivan had just openly accused a lieutenant general of politicizing a memorial service, a charge that, in military culture, carried profound implications. Would you care to elaborate on what political statements you believe General Washington was making? Hansen asked, his tone neutral, but eyes sharp. Sullivan leaned forward, a hint of zealotry entering his voice. General Washington was using the eulogy to suggest Sergeant Collins' death was something other than the training accident determined by official investigation. She was implying cover-up conspiracy, undermining confidence in the chain of command during a solemn ceremony. And this justified drawing your weapon. I believed I was witnessing the subversion of military values in real time, sir. My response was proportional to the threat those values faced. The room fell silent as the implications of Sullivan's statement settled over the assembly. He wasn't offering a mental health defense or claiming momentary lapse in judgment. He was doubling down, presenting his actions as righteous defense of tradition against internal corruption. Olivia watched the panel's reactions carefully. Green appeared troubled, Mitchell calculatingly neutral, and Hansen professionally inscrutable. But more telling were the expressions of junior officers at the back of the room, the mixture of discomfort and recognition, suggesting Sullivan's worldview wasn't as isolated as Pentagon leadership might wish to believe. General Washington, Hansen said, turning to her, would you like to respond to Lieutenant Sullivan's characterization of your remarks at the ceremony? Olivia stood, understanding that this moment would define not just the hearing's trajectory, but the narrative that would emerge from it. Sir, my eulogy for Sergeant Collins acknowledged his service record and his character. It also acknowledged his concerns about institutional fairness, concerns he had raised through proper channels before his death. I made no specific allegations regarding his death, but I did honor his commitment to integrity, even when that commitment carried personal risk. She paused, gauging the room. What concerns me more than Lieutenant Sullivan's actions is the environment that fostered them. His psychological evaluation 3 years ago explicitly noted concerns about racial bias and authority issues. Those concerns were overridden by Colonel Monroe, who then assigned Sullivan to security detail for his ceremony honoring a Black Marine who had documented systemic discrimination. Monroe stiffened visibly, his composure cracking for the first time. General, you're making unfounded allegations that have no place in this proceeding. Am I Colonel? Olivia reached into her briefcase and removed a folder. This contains Lieutenant Sullivan's psychological evaluation, including the specific concerns about racial animus and your signed override of those concerns. It also contains the security assignment roster, showing you personally selected Sullivan for the Arlington detail, bypassing the standard rotation protocol. She placed the folder before Hansen. These aren't allegations, Colonel. They're documented facts that establish a pattern, one that culminated in an armed officer confronting a superior at a memorial service. Sullivan's attorney stood abruptly. General Hansen, this is an ambush. My client is being subjected to a character assassination that goes far beyond the scope of this hearing. Your client drew a weapon on a lieutenant general during a funeral service. Admiral Green interjected, patience visibly thinning. I think character is very much within the scope of our considerations. Sullivan himself remained eerily calm, his gaze fixed on Olivia with an intensity that bordered on fascination. When he finally spoke, his voice carried throughout the room, despite its quiet tone. I am a product of this institution, he said slowly, shaped by its values, trained by its standards. If there's something wrong with me, General Washington, then there's something wrong with the system that made me. The statement hung in the air, not a defense, but a challenge, an indictment that implicated everyone present. That's enough, Lieutenant, Hansen said sharply, but Sullivan continued, his voice gaining strength. This isn't about one incident at Arlington. This is about the soul of the military, about whether we maintain the standards that made America's fighting force the most effective in history, or whether we sacrifice those standards on the altar of social experimentation. Lieutenant, Hansen's voice cracked like a whip, but Sullivan seemed beyond concern for protocol now. I'm just the first, he said, looking directly at Olivia. There are more of us than you think. Men and women who refuse to watch the institution they love be dismantled from within by people who put identity politics above combat readiness. The mask had fallen completely, now revealing the ideology that had driven Sullivan to draw his weapon. Not momentary insanity or PTSD, but a coherent worldview that framed diversity itself as existential threat. This hearing is temporarily suspended, Hansen announced, rising from his seat. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As the room began to clear, Sullivan's gaze remained locked with Olivia's, a silent communication passing between them. Acknowledgement that whatever happened next, the true nature of the conflict had been exposed. This wasn't about one lieutenant's actions or one general's response. It was about two fundamentally different visions of what the military should be and who deserved to lead it. Outside the hearing room, Admiral Green approached Olivia in the corridor. He just did your job for you, Green said quietly. Turned what could have been framed as an isolated incident into a manifesto. He believes every word, Olivia replied. That's what makes him dangerous and useful. He's saying out loud what others only whisper in private. Green glanced toward where Sullivan was conferring with his attorney Monroe, hovering nearby with visible concern. The question now is how many others share his convictions, but possess better impulse control. More than we want to believe, Olivia said. Fewer than they think. The Admiral studied her with the calculating assessment of someone who had navigated political waters for decades. What's your endgame here, Washington? What does victory look like to you? It was a question Olivia had asked herself through the sleepless night. The answer had come to her only as dawn broke over the Potomac. Not victory, she replied. Transformation. A military where Sullivan's worldview becomes so untenable that those who share it can no longer find safe harbor within our ranks. Green nodded slowly. A worthy goal, but the path there runs through territory more treacherous than any battlefield you've seen. I know, Olivia said, watching, as more officers gathered in small clusters down the hallway, their body language telegraphing allegiances forming and solidifying. But as Marcus used to say, the most important fights aren't the ones you choose. They're the ones that choose you. The Admiral's weathered face creased in a grim smile. Then I suggest you prepare for battle, General, because whatever happens when we reconvene, this war is just beginning. The Pentagon's military courtroom hummed with suppressed tension when proceedings resumed. The three-member panel had returned with faces set in practiced neutrality, but the room's atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Sullivan's unexpected manifesto had transformed a disciplinary hearing into something far more consequential, a public reckoning with ideologies usually kept behind closed doors. Olivia noticed additional personnel had slipped into the back row during the recess, high-ranking officers who had no direct connection to the case but clearly sensed its importance. Their presence confirmed what she already knew. Word of Sullivan's statements had spread throughout the building, elevating the stakes beyond one lieutenant's career. General Hansen cleared his throat. Before we continue, I want to clarify the parameters of this hearing. We are here to determine appropriate action regarding Lieutenant Sullivan's conduct at Arlington Cemetery. We are not conducting a broad inquiry into military culture or policy. The limitation was transparent, an attempt to contain the expanding implications of Sullivan's declarations. Sullivan's attorney leaned forward. General, given my client's statements, I request a psychological evaluation before proceeding further. His comments suggest emotional distress that may impact his capacity to participate effectively in these proceedings. Olivia recognized the tactical retreat. Sullivan had revealed too much too explicitly. Now his legal team was attempting to reframe his ideology as mental instability, a strategy that would both protect him and diminish the significance of his claims. The lieutenant seemed quite lucid and intentional in his statements, Admiral Green observed dryly. Mistaken perhaps, but hardly incapacitated. Sullivan straightened in his chair. I withdraw nothing I said, sir. Every word was considered and meant. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Sullivan shook it off. No more games. If I'm to be judged, let it be for what I actually believe, not some convenient fiction about stress or trauma. Hansen studied him with narrowed eyes. Very well, Lieutenant. In that case, let's proceed directly to the evidence recovered from your person following the Arlington incident. He nodded to an aide who distributed copies of a document to the panel members in both parties. This list was found in Lieutenant Sullivan's pocket when he was apprehended. It contains the names of 23 officers, all from minority backgrounds, under the heading, Targets for Correction. Would you care to explain this document, Lieutenant? Sullivan glanced at his attorney, who gave a slight headshake, but again he disregarded the advice. Those officers have advanced beyond their qualifications due to preferential treatment. Each has demonstrated values inconsistent with military tradition, while being protected from consequences by diversity mandates. The bluntness of his response elicited murmurs from the observers at the back of the room. Hansen continued, and what exactly did you mean by correction, Lieutenant? Professional consequences, exposure of their inadequacies, restoration of merit-based standards. Not violence, Hansen pressed. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. I believe in institutional solutions, sir, though I note that throughout military history, courage has sometimes required direct action when systems fail. The ambiguity of his answer hung in the air, neither confirming nor denying violent intent, while subtly justifying it as potentially necessary. General Washington's name appears at the top of this list, circled in red ink, Hansen continued. Why single her out? Sullivan's gaze shifted to Olivia, his expression hardening. Because she represents everything we've sacrificed for political correctness. An officer fast-tracked through the ranks to satisfy demographic quotas, now using her unearned position to dismantle the very standards that built America's military supremacy. The accusation was so flagrantly false, so disconnected from Olivia's well-documented combat record and 3 decades of distinguished service, that for a moment the room fell completely silent. Even Sullivan's most sympathetic observers seemed taken aback by the blatant distortion. Admiral Green broke the silence, his voice deceptively conversational. Lieutenant, are you aware that General Washington earned her Purple Heart pulling 3 Marines, including Sergeant Collins, from a burning vehicle under enemy fire in Kandahar? That she completed Ranger School with the highest marks in her class? That she's been passed over for promotion twice, despite recommendations from combat commanders? Sullivan's expression didn't change. Medals in schools can be manipulated, sir. Standards adjusted behind the scenes. And you believe this conspiracy to promote unqualified minorities extends through multiple administrations, military branches, and command structures, Green pressed, all coordinated seamlessly without detection until you recognize the pattern. For the first time, Sullivan seemed to recognize the trap being laid, that his worldview stated plainly revealed itself as paranoid fantasy rather than reasoned critique. He retreated to safer ground. I believe standards have been gradually compromised in the name of diversity, sir. The effects speak for themselves. Indeed they do, Green replied. Our current military leadership, shaped by these diversity initiatives you so disdain, has overseen the most effective, adaptable fighting force in our history. Perhaps you could explain how these supposedly compromised standards have weakened our capabilities. Sullivan's attorney finally intervened. Admiral, my client is not on trial for his opinions about military policy. We're here regarding a specific incident at Arlington. An incident directly connected to those opinions? Olivia pointed out. Lieutenant Sullivan has made it clear that his actions weren't a momentary lapse, but the logical extension of his beliefs about who belongs in military leadership. Hansen raised a hand for silence. Point taken, General Washington. Let's shift focus. He turned back to Sullivan. Lieutenant, the security footage shows you deliberately removing Sergeant Collins' photograph before drawing your weapon. Why target this symbolic representation of a decorated Marine? Sullivan's jaw tightened. Collins was no hero. He used his position to push an agenda collecting grievances and framing routine personnel matters as discrimination. His report was activism disguised as military concern. You've read this report, Hansen asked sharply. A flicker of hesitation crossed Sullivan's face, the first crack in his composure. I was briefed on its general contents as part of my security role. By whom? Sullivan glanced toward Colonel Monroe, then back to Hansen. I don't recall specifically, sir. It was mentioned in security briefings regarding potential protests at military ceremonies. The evasion was obvious, but Hansen didn't press further. Instead, he turned to Olivia. General Washington, you mentioned earlier that Sergeant Collins had documented cases of discrimination before his death. Was this report submitted through official channels? Yes, sir, Olivia replied. 3 weeks before his death, Sergeant Collins submitted a comprehensive report detailing 18 incidents across 4 bases where personnel of color faced retribution after reporting discrimination. The report included names, dates, and corroborating testimony from multiple witnesses. On what became of this report, it disappeared from the system within 48 hours of submission. When Sergeant Collins inquired about its status, he was told no such report had been received. Hansen frowned. That's a serious allegation, General. Do you have evidence that this report actually existed and was deliberately removed? Olivia reached into her briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. This contains Sergeant Collins' personal copy of the report, which he entrusted to me along with a video statement recorded the day before his death expressing concerns for his safety due to the report's contents. She placed the envelope on the table before Hansen. It also contains evidence that Sergeant Collins' death was not the training accident described in official records. Witness statements that were removed from the investigation file indicate equipment tampering consistent with deliberate sabotage. Monroe stood abruptly. This is outrageous. General Washington is using this hearing to promote conspiracy theories about a thoroughly investigated accident. It dishonors Sergeant Collins' memory and undermines confidence in military procedures. With respect, Colonel, Olivia replied, her voice steady. What dishonors Sergeant Collins is the suppression of his final act of service documentation of systemic failures that he believed compromised the integrity of the institution he loved. Hansen opened the envelope and began reviewing its contents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he turned each page. After several minutes of tense silence, he looked up. These allegations are far beyond the scope of this hearing, he said finally. They require a separate comprehensive investigation by appropriate authorities. That's been attempted, sir, Olivia replied. Twice. Each investigation was reassigned, then closed without findings. By whose authority? The documentation doesn't specify. The chain of command above Colonel Monroe becomes opaque. All eyes turned to Monroe, whose expression remained rigidly professional, despite the implicit accusation. General Washington is connecting unrelated administrative decisions to create the appearance of conspiracy. It's beneath her rank and destructive to the institution she claims to serve. Sullivan, watching this exchange, permitted himself a thin smile, the first sign of genuine emotion since the hearing resumed. It was a tactical error that didn't go unnoticed. You find this amusing, Lieutenant? Admiral Green asked. I find it illuminating, Sir Sullivan replied. General Washington accuses others of conspiracy while engaging in exactly the behavior she condemns, using her position to undermine proper procedures when they don't produce her desired outcome. Drawing a weapon on a superior officer is hardly proper procedure, Lieutenant Green observed, yet you seem to consider it justified. Extraordinary. Extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary measures. Sullivan replied, the words hanging in the air, like a justification, not just for his actions, but for whatever might follow. General Mitchell, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke. It seems to me we have two separate matters before us. Lieutenant Sullivan's conduct at Arlington, which clearly warrants disciplinary action, and these broader allegations regarding Sergeant Collins' report and death, which require their own investigation. He turned to Hansen. I suggest we focus on resolving the first matter today and establish a separate process for the second. The suggestion was reasonable on its face, a procedural separation that anyone familiar with military bureaucracy would recognize as standard practice. But Olivia immediately understood the strategy: containment through compartmentalization. Sullivan would face consequences for his individual actions, while the systemic issues he represented would be diverted into administrative channels designed to diffuse urgency. Sir, she said, addressing Hansen directly, with respect, these matters cannot be separated because they aren't separate. Lieutenant Sullivan's actions at Arlington weren't isolated from the culture that normalized his views or the system that promoted him, despite documented concerns about his fitness. The weapon he pointed at my chest was merely the visible manifestation of an ideology that has worked more subtly throughout our ranks. Hansen's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture suggested her words had landed. He turned to Sullivan. Lieutenant, earlier you stated that you are a product of this institution, that if there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with the system that made you. Do you stand by that assessment? Sullivan hesitated, sensing the trap implicit in his own words. I was speaking rhetorically, sir. Were you? Because it seems to me you were making precisely the point General Washington is advancing, that your actions reflect broader institutional failures rather than purely individual choices. Sullivan's attorney placed a hand on his client's arm, urging restraint, but Sullivan had committed himself to a course that allowed no retreat. The failure isn't what you think, sir, he said, his voice hardening. The failure is allowing political pressure to override military excellence, permitting standards to be diluted in the name of representation. I acted as I did because someone needed to draw a line against the erosion of everything that makes our fighting force effective. By threatening a decorated combat veteran who happens to be a black woman? Green asked incredulously. By challenging an officer who uses identity politics to advance an agenda incompatible with military values? Sullivan countered. Her race and gender are incidental. Her ideology is the threat. Olivia had remained silent during this exchange, watching as Sullivan systematically dismantled his own defense with each unfiltered statement. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried throughout the room. Lieutenant Sullivan's candor is illuminating, she said. He hasn't described a momentary lapse in judgment, but a considered worldview in which preserving a particular vision of military culture justifies abandoning the very discipline and respect for chain of command that culture supposedly values. She turned to face the panel directly. This isn't about one incident or one officer. It's about whether we have the courage to acknowledge that our institution, for all its strengths and values, still harbors systemic biases that compromise our effectiveness and betray our highest principles. The room fell silent as her words settled over the assembly. Even Sullivan seemed momentarily subdued, perhaps recognizing that his own testimony had accomplished what Olivia alone might not have: concrete evidence of the ideology she described. Hansen cleared his throat. This hearing will recess for 1 hour while the panel confers. We will reconvene at 1400 hours for our determination. As the room began to clear, Olivia noticed a junior officer slip a note to Hansen, who read it with a slight frown before nodding dismissal. Whatever communication had just occurred, it had added another variable to an already complex equation. In the hallway outside, officers gathered in small clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. The fault lines were visible in their groupings, those who saw Sullivan's actions as aberration versus those who recognized them as symptom. Olivia kept her distance from both camps, finding a quiet alcove where she could review her notes before the final session. Admiral Green approached his expression grave. "The narrative has shifted," he said without preamble. "Your strategy worked perhaps too well." Meaning, Sullivan's testimony has forced acknowledgement of ideological divisions that leadership has long preferred to ignore. That creates opportunity for change, but also risk of backlash. Green glanced toward where Sullivan was conferring with Monroe, their body language suggesting disagreement. There are those who will view today's proceedings as confirmation that their fears about political correctness undermining military tradition are justified. Better to have these conflicts in the open than festering beneath the surface, Olivia replied. Perhaps, but be prepared whatever the panel decides today, this doesn't end here. You've opened a door that many powerful interests wanted kept closed. I didn't open it, Olivia corrected. Marcus did. I'm just preventing it from being slammed shut again. Green studied her with the calculating assessment of someone who had navigated Pentagon politics for decades. The Joint Chiefs are meeting now, drafting a response to the Civilian Oversight Committees, already demanding briefings. The White House has requested updates. This has expanded beyond military jurisdiction. Good, Olivia said simply. Some infections require external intervention. Green's weathered face creased with something between concern and admiration. You've committed yourself to a path with no safe retreat, Washington. I hope you understand what that means for your career, your legacy. My career isn't what matters here, she replied. Neither is my legacy. What matters is ensuring that officers of all backgrounds can serve without facing the obstacles Marcus documented or the weapon Sullivan pointed. The Admiral nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I believe you're right. I just don't know if being right will be enough. When the hearing reconvened, the room had filled beyond its previous capacity. Word had spread throughout the Pentagon, drawing officers who recognized the historic significance of what was unfolding. They lined the walls, standing in rigid attention as the panel members returned to their seats. General Hansen's expression betrayed nothing as he called the room to order. This panel has reviewed the evidence presented and reached a determination regarding Lieutenant James Sullivan's actions at Arlington National Cemetery on May 27, 2025. He turned to Sullivan. Lieutenant Sullivan, this panel finds that your conduct constituted a serious breach of military discipline, a direct violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and actions unbecoming an officer. You will be immediately removed from active duty pending court-martial proceedings on charges of insubordination conduct, prejudicial to good order, and assault on a superior officer. Sullivan's face remained impassive, but his shoulders stiffened slightly, the only visible reaction to the pronouncement of his military career's end. Additionally, Hansen continued, in light of the evidence presented regarding Lieutenant Sullivan's stated beliefs and documented targeting of minority officers, this panel recommends a comprehensive review of all personnel decisions in which he participated with particular attention to evaluations of officers named in his correction list. This additional measure, extending beyond Sullivan himself to examine the impact of his biases, represented a significant acknowledgement of systemic concerns. Olivia noted Monroe's expression darkening as the implications became clear. The investigation would inevitably lead to his own role in overriding Sullivan's psychological evaluation and positioning him in sensitive assignments. Regarding the separate matter of Sergeant Marcus Collins' report and the circumstances of his death, Hansen continued, this panel lacks the authority to initiate the kind of comprehensive investigation these allegations warrant. However, he paused, glancing briefly toward where Mitchell sat with carefully controlled neutrality. We are recommending to the Joint Chiefs that an independent commission be established with appropriate security clearances and investigative powers to examine these matters thoroughly. The recommendation fell short of the immediate action Olivia had hoped for, but represented more progress than the bureaucratic burial she had feared. A commission, if properly constituted, could pursue the connections between Sullivan's ideological network and the systemic issues Marcus had documented. Finally, Hansen said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, I wish to address something Lieutenant Sullivan said earlier. He described himself as a product of this institution, suggesting that his actions reflect values instilled by military culture. As an officer who has served for 35 years, I categorically reject this characterization. Hansen's departure from procedural neutrality drew surprised glances from the other panel members, but he continued undeterred. The core values of the United States military honor, courage, integrity are not compatible with targeting fellow officers based on their race or gender. They are not compatible with undermining the chain of command when it includes individuals who don't fit one's preconceived notion of what leadership should look like. And they are certainly not compatible with drawing a weapon on a superior officer during a memorial service for a fallen Marine. His gaze swept the room, making eye contact with the observers lining the walls. If there are others who share Lieutenant Sullivan's views, who believe that diversity inherently compromises excellence, or that their personal judgment supersedes their oath of service, I encourage them to examine whether they truly belong in today's military. The statement landed like a gauntlet, thrown a challenge to the silent sympathizers who had allowed ideologies like Sullivan's to persist unchallenged. This hearing is adjourned. As the room began to clear, Sullivan was led away by military police, his career effectively over, his legacy now defined by a moment of hatred captured on camera and broadcast to the world. But the slight smile that flickered across his face as he passed, Olivia suggested he viewed himself not as defeated, but as martyred, a first casualty in a conflict he believed would continue without him. Colonel Monroe attempted to exit quickly, but Admiral Green intercepted him with a quiet word that caused Monroe's face to drain of color. Whatever had been communicated, it clearly signaled that Sullivan's downfall would not be contained to Sullivan alone. Outside the Pentagon, the scene had transformed since morning. What had begun as a small vigil by veterans supporting Marcus Collins had grown into a gathering of hundreds of military personnel in civilian clothes, veterans of multiple generations, families of service members, all united under the rallying cry that had spread across social media: "Tell the truth." News crews captured the moment as Olivia emerged from the building, her uniform immaculate, her posture straight, despite the emotional and physical toll of the past 24 hours. She made no statement to the press, maintaining the professional reserve expected of her rank, but the message was clear in her determined stride and unwavering gaze. This was not the end, but the beginning. 3 weeks later, Olivia stood alone in Arlington National Cemetery, the early morning mist shrouding the endless rows of white markers in ethereal light. She had come before visiting hours, using her rank to gain access to the solitude she needed for this moment. Marcus Collins' headstone was simple, like all the others' name-rank dates of service military honors, nothing to indicate the courage it had taken to document what he had seen, to speak truth when silence would have been safer. She placed a single white rose beside the stone, then straightened and offered a formal salute, a gesture of respect between equals. "It's happening, Marcus," she said quietly. "Not as quickly as we'd hoped, but it's happening." In the weeks since the hearing, developments had accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. Sullivan's court-martial had expanded to include charges related to a network of officers who had systematically undermined the careers of minority personnel. Monroe faced his own investigation for abuse of authority and falsification of records. Most significantly, the independent commission Hansen had recommended had been established with unprecedented powers and a mandate to examine not just individual incidents, but patterns of institutional bias. The Arlington footage had catalyzed public attention in ways that years of more measured advocacy had not. Lawmakers demanded briefings, veterans groups issued statements of support for reform, current service members began sharing their own experiences through secure channels established by the commission, stories that collectively formed an undeniable pattern. Change was coming. Not without resistance, there had been backlash, counter-narratives, attempts to frame the entire movement as an attack on military tradition, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly toward acknowledgement and accountability. As Olivia turned to leave, she noticed a figure standing at a respectful distance, a woman holding the hand of a small boy in a civilian suit. Marcus's sister and nephew come to visit his resting place. Jamal's face lit with recognition as Olivia approached. "You're the lady who didn't move when the man pointed his gun," he said with the directness of childhood. The one Uncle Marcus said was the bravest person he knew. Your uncle was the brave one, Olivia replied, kneeling to meet his gaze at eye level. I'm just continuing what he started. The boy considered this with solemn intensity. Mom says Uncle Marcus is a hero now, that everyone knows what he did. That's right, Olivia confirmed. Your uncle helped make things better for a lot of people. That's the most important kind of hero. Jamal nodded, processing this definition of heroism with remarkable maturity for his age. The man with the gun, he said after a moment, was he a bad person? The question, innocent yet profound, gave Olivia pause. How to explain to a child the complex interplay of ideology, institutional culture, and individual choice that had culminated in Sullivan's actions? He made bad choices, she said carefully, and he believed things that hurt other people. But the most important thing to remember isn't about him. It's about all the people who are working to make sure what happened to your uncle doesn't happen to anyone else. The boy seemed satisfied with this answer, his attention already drifting to a groundskeeper working nearby. But his mother's eyes held Olivia's with shared understanding of how much remained unspoken, how much work still lay ahead. Marcus always said you were the one who could change things, she said quietly. That you understood the system from the inside, but hadn't been captured by it. I'm trying, Olivia replied simply. We all are. As she walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Olivia noticed a solitary figure standing beside a newly installed memorial bench, a distinguished older man in civilian clothes whose military bearing marked him as clearly as any uniform. It took her a moment to recognize General Hayes, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, who had initially attempted to place her on administrative leave. He made no move to approach her, but his presence was clearly intentional, a silent acknowledgement that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Recognition, respect, warning. Perhaps elements of all three. Olivia nodded once in his direction, a gesture neither submissive nor challenging, but one of professional acknowledgement between adversaries who recognized the gravity of their shared purpose despite profound disagreements about how to achieve it. The path ahead would not be smooth. The Commission's work would face obstruction from those with careers and reputations at stake. The broader cultural changes needed would require generations, not months. And there would be other Sullivans, perhaps less obvious in their methods, but no less committed to preserving the status quo they benefited from. But something fundamental had shifted. The weapon Sullivan had pointed at Arlington had made visible what had long been obscured by bureaucracy and tradition. The truth Marcus had died documenting could no longer be buried in redacted reports and administrative procedures. As Olivia reached her car, her phone buzzed with a message from Major Chen. Commission appointment confirmed. Testimony begins next week. The Underground sends regards. Marcus's network, now evolved into something more formal, more powerful, continued its work, ensuring that momentum wouldn't be lost to bureaucratic inertia or political calculation. Olivia looked back toward the endless rows of white markers stretching across Arlington's hallowed ground. Generations of service members who had sworn the same oath, worn the same uniform, faced different battles, but served the same ideals. Among them now rested Marcus Collins, whose courage had forced a reckoning long overdue. Honor isn't born from medals, she whispered, echoing his words from their last conversation. It comes from the moments when you refuse to back down, when someone points a gun at your chest. In that moment at Arlington, standing before Sullivan's weapon, Olivia had embodied that principle not just for herself, but for every service member who had faced more subtle, but no less real threats to their dignity and belonging. Her refusal to flinch had created a fracture point in a system designed to absorb and diffuse pressure for change. The Commission's first public session was scheduled for the following Monday. Olivia would testify not just about Sullivan's actions or Marcus's death, but about the patterns they represented, the invisible structures that had shaped military culture for generations. She would speak not as victim seeking redress, but as leader demanding accountability, using the authority of her rank and record to ensure that the door Marcus had opened with his final act of service remained firmly ajar. As she drove away from Arlington, the morning sun finally breaking through the mist, Olivia's thoughts returned to young Jamal's innocent question at the memorial service. Why is that man afraid of her mama? The truth she now understood was both simpler and more profound than she had realized in that moment. Sullivan's fear, like the fear of all those who resisted the military's evolution, wasn't really about standards or tradition or combat readiness. It was about the loss of unearned certainty, the comfortable assumption that authority naturally belonged to people who looked and thought as they did. What Sullivan had seen when he looked at Olivia wasn't just a black woman in a general's uniform. He had seen the future of military where excellence and integrity, not demographics or tradition, determined leadership. A future where officers like Marcus Collins could document injustice without paying with their lives. A future where young officers of all backgrounds could serve with the certainty that their contributions would be judged on merit alone. That future remained incomplete, its full realization perhaps beyond Olivia's own career. But standing tall before Sullivan's weapon had moved it one step closer to reality, had demonstrated with unmistakable clarity that courage takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with unwavering resolve in the face of hatred. As Washington, D.C. came into view, the Pentagon's imposing structure visible in the distance, Olivia prepared herself for the work ahead. The commission, the testimony, the inevitable resistance from those with power to protect. But for the first time since Marcus's death, she felt something like optimism, not naive hope, but the grounded certainty that systems, even entrenched ones, could change when their flaws were exposed to sufficient light. Sullivan had been right about one thing: he was just the first. Others would follow their methods, perhaps less dramatic, but their purpose the same: preservation of privilege disguised as protection of standards. But they would now face a military awakening to its full potential, a fighting force strengthened rather than compromised by its diversity, enhanced rather than diminished by the contributions of all who served with honor. The weapon Sullivan had pointed had revealed not weakness, but extraordinary strength, the unbreakable resolve of those who had always had to be twice as good to be considered equal. That strength, once fully recognized and embraced, would transform the military in ways Sullivan and his allies feared, but could no longer prevent. 3 days later, as Olivia prepared her testimony for the commission's first session, a package arrived at her office. Inside was a framed photograph, the one Sullivan had swept from the podium at Arlington, now restored and enclosed with a simple note in Jamal's childish handwriting. Uncle Marcus said, "We win when we don't let them make us afraid." You weren't afraid. That means we're winning. Olivia placed the photograph on her desk, positioned so that Marcus's face would be visible as she completed her testimony, a reminder of why this battle mattered, and the courage required to fight it. Not with weapons or threats, but with unwavering commitment to the highest principles of the institution they both had served. The path forward would not be easy. The commission's work would face obstruction, its findings perhaps contested by those with power to protect. The broader cultural changes needed would require sustained effort across multiple generations of leadership. But the door had been opened. The truth was emerging into light, and those who had once operated in shadows now faced the scrutiny they had long avoided. As Olivia reviewed her final notes for the commission, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, the latest communication from the expanding network Marcus had built. New testimony secured from 3 officers on Sullivan's list. Evidence of coordinated suppression confirmed. The truth won't be buried this time. She smiled slightly, imagining Marcus's satisfaction at how his work continued beyond his death, how the courage of one sergeant had catalyzed a movement that even a lieutenant's weapon couldn't intimidate into silence. Outside her window, Washington, D.C. continued its eternal dance of power and politics, of ambition and ideology. But within the Pentagon's walls, something had shifted, a rebalancing that would ultimately strengthen rather than compromise the military's core mission. Sullivan's weapon, intended to intimidate, had instead illuminated. His hatred, meant to suppress, had instead exposed. And the system he had sought to preserve would now be transformed, not destroyed, but renewed through honest reckoning with its flaws and recommitment to its highest ideals. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave for the commission hearing, Olivia paused before Marcus's photograph, offering a silent promise to the friend whose final act of service had made this moment possible. The truth would be told. The system would be held accountable, and the military they both had served would emerge stronger for facing its failures with the same courage it demanded on the battlefield. In the end, that was what honor truly meant: not medals or rank or tradition, but the unwavering commitment to stand tall when confronted with injustice, whether it took the form of enemy fire or a weapon pointed by one wearing the same uniform. Unbending, uncompromising, unafraid.